Hi, this is Paul. I'm going to do a little video, which is a Synod preview. It's not going to preview everything in the massive 600 plus page agenda. It's going to preview what a lot of people are sort of focusing on. Now, there'll be a lot more else at Synod, which will be worth covering and seeing, but this is sort of where the relevance realization is for the Christian Reformed Church right now. Now, Synod is nearly upon us. May 29 at 7 p.m. Eastern, Synod convenes online on Zoom. There will have some worship, some prayer, some information, and probably the most important thing they will do at that meeting will be to elect officers. So there's a president, there's a chair, a vice chair, a first recorder, and a second recorder, and the four of them basically make up the team that will have to run Synod. Their job is pretty responsible, and there'll be a lot of attention paid this year because of the way Synod ended last year, which was they couldn't get their agenda finished. And that proved to be a very big deal because often the way Synod works is that first you have these advisory committees, then you have the plenary sessions, and the plenary sessions are where things are finalized, but the advisory committees give the plenary sessions what they need to work on. And so if there's a particular knotty aspect, those things come late to the plenary sessions, and therefore the most important things generally get pushed to the end. And so one of the issues was never dealt with, which has added to the drama of this Synod. So May 29, 7 p.m. Eastern, that will be recorded and published on the denominational YouTube page. You'll see a Zoom with lots of little pictures, probably. I don't know how else they're going to record it. And then the new officers will be elected, and we'll find out who. The list of people who will likely be officers is quite small. But Kent Hendricks has already named who he thinks probably will be and should be, and I tend to agree with him. But the problem with naming these kinds of things is once they're named, that sort of figures into the equation. Except that, now I know some of you might watch this and you might see, oh wow, 1, 2, 3,000 people watched that video. That won't be enough to change anything at Synod. The vast majority of delegates, nearly 200 of them, most of them have never heard my name, nor have they watched any of my videos. Some have, many haven't. And so don't imagine that this is some big outsized influence on what will happen at Synod. So May 29, 7 p.m. Eastern, it begins. June 5, advisory committees begin to meet, get to know each other on Zoom. Advisory committees are usually around 20 people. And at that point, they'll probably share stories. And the last year's executive committee has already named these advisory committees. There's a program report that all the synodical delegates have gotten already, and they're assigned to a particular advisory committee. And so online, they will just sort of get to know each other. They're not going to conduct any negotiation or business or deliberation online. They're not going to try to do that. But it seems wise to sort of jumpstart that process online if you can, get some basic questions answered and all of that. Synod itself opens June 14 with opening worship, and then advisory committees will begin not too long after that. And again, advisory committee meetings are not recorded, and they're sort of executive session meetings. Synodical delegates are allowed to visit other meetings, but usually they're so busy working on their own stuff they don't have time to visit anyone else. There are usually denominational functionaries, seminary professors, other people who hopefully can help the advisory committee do their work. And again, the way Synod works is that massive 600-page book comes in there. There'll be some other supplemental things that come in late. All of that goes into these advisory committees. And then the advisory committees is really where a lot of the work happens. And those advisory committees take all of that material, chew them up into recommendations for the full Synod, and then Synod at the full Synod acts on those advisory committee recommendations, and that's the way Synod happens. Plenary sessions begin June 17. Now, what are people holding their breath about? One of the things that is true about Synod after Synod is that it's sort of like American elections and presidencies. Everybody thinks they know what's going to happen, but then there's a reason you go ahead and have the event, because Often the big thing will be the big thing, and I think that will be the case in this synod, but there will also be other things that in years to come will prove to be important things that right now we're not seeing or noticing. But the two things that people are holding their breath about are the gravamen, which I've talked about previously. Basically, that has to do with how much latitude is there in belief permitted of office bearers. Now, an office bearer can be a minister of the word. That's the office that I hold. Can be a commissioned pastor. There are people without necessarily an MDiv who function as a minister of the word in particular circumstances. Elders and deacons. Those are really the four offices in the Christian Reformed Church. They're sometimes seen as three because commissioned pastors are sometimes seen as sort of an office of elder. Anyway, those are the main offices, and in order to fulfill this office, you have to sign a covenant of office bearers, which has been an update of an older document called a form of subscription. Calvin University professors also have to sign a modified version of that to be hired as a professor at Calvin University. So that will be a big piece of it, and that was the agenda item that never got resolved in Synod 2023. And so there will be a lot there. A lot of people are looking at that thinking that's going to somehow resolve the current crisis of the Christian Reformed Church, which is the debate over same-sex marriage. And there are 20-ish churches that have released statements affirming same-sex marriage for their congregations. Classis Grand Rapids East, arguably the most strategic classis in the denomination, has been refusing to discipline congregations in their midst that have been doing things with respect to same-sex marriage or releasing statements. That's sort of the hub of the crisis right now. And the question is, what will Synod do to churches and Classis Grand Rapids East and potentially other classes, as they basically told Synod 2022 that they had no intention of abiding by the human sexuality report that was passed. The question is how Synod can discipline individual churches or classes, because there's really not a clear mechanism in the church order as there is for many other things. And so then the question will be, what will Synod do? A lot of people in the Christian Reformed Church sort of look over their shoulder at the Reformed Church in America. That denomination has basically fragmented and come apart because while the overall denomination wanted to maintain a standard of traditional marriage in them, there were a number of classes that were basically refusing to abide by it, and the denominational machinery, their rules could not allow the majority at Synod to act against those classes and basically have them comply with the rule of the majority of the church. And so what happened in that church was that the church has been splitting up. Now, the Christian Reformed Church is a much younger denomination than the Reformed Church in America. Its rules are different, and so it's quite feasible that Synod can basically do what it wants. But doing what it wants depends on majorities at Synod, and majorities tend to be built up of coalitions, and coalitions pay a lot of attention to, we don't want to be tyrants, we don't want to act too soon, etc., etc. So I'll get into some of the particulars of that in a minute, but generally speaking, the Christian Reformed Church is in a crisis. The Christian Reformed Church has been losing members since the early 1990s. The Christian Reformed Church's flagship institution, owned by the Christian Reformed Church, is Calvin University, and Calvin University itself is having an unrelated crisis because the president of the university stepped down because he admitted to texting a woman who was not his wife, and apparently she complained. But there's a whole lot of murkiness around this thing. Title IX was never actually enacted. Now the president and his wife are suing the college, and so more disclosure came out in the lawsuit, and then the Calvin board responded to the lawsuit and gave more information that was one of these videos that I thought about doing something on, decided maybe I better not. But that's in the background of this. The synod actually happens on Calvin's campus. There's not a word in the current Acts of Synod with respect to this, which is interesting. Might be just a matter of timing. Whether historically Calvin or the Christian Reformed Church does, in extreme cases, get involved with things going on at Calvin University, whether an advisory committee through an overture communication will in fact get involved with this, I don't know. That would sort of be some surprise that would come up in this synod. Another thing that just came out recently is that the Banner, which is the denomination's official monthly magazine, will be losing its ministry share funding after 2027. A couple of years ago, the Christian Reformed Church decided to pivot on how it receives money from local congregations and basically asked local congregations to pledge money, and those receipts have been falling. More and more congregations in the denomination are shrinking, and if a congregation gets to the point that they really don't have enough money for their own operations, much less to send anything to the denomination, more and more congregations stop giving. If a congregation is unhappy with denominational politics, those congregations stop giving, and for the most part, the denomination has never really tried to discipline or coerce congregations into offering their ministry shares. And what this has meant is that there's been a contraction of denominational ministry going on, and as if the numbers of members continue to go down, or if there's a split in the denomination, then that could go down even further. Calvin University isn't directly dependent upon the denomination for funding, but Calvin University enrollment has been going down while its rival denomination, its rival college, which is not owned by the denomination, or one of the rivals, Dordt University in Iowa, has been having record enrollment. And so many see this as an expression of, I see it as an expression of the fact that the Christian Reformed Church is beginning more conservative, and some of that has been expressed in people choosing to send their graduating high school seniors to Dordt rather than Calvin. So there's a lot going on in the Christian Reformed Church. What's interesting to me is that if you read the Banner, I don't know if you would be in any way aware that there is a crisis, which to me is very interesting. Now, let's talk a little bit about votes. Kent Hendricks has been doing an outstanding job with a Substack. He's been digging into a bunch of things in the denomination, similar to what I've been doing, and we've now become aware of each other, and so he posted a recommendation for my channel on his Substack. I've been recommending his Substack. Lord willing, he and I and Clay Leibolt are going to have a conversation this week. Clay Leibolt is a retired minister in the Christian Reformed Church who has his own blog. Clay's been a controversial figure. He's been on the channel twice before, I believe, once or twice on the channel with John Van Donk. He's a good friend of John Van Donk. And Clay's been a controversial figure in the denomination for a very long time. And anyway, so we're going to have a conversation as sort of three people who've been writing or publishing about the Christian Reformed Church. It's going to be a very interesting conversation. Kent apparently is Clay's nephew. So one of the things you learn very quickly in the Christian Reformed Church is that there are a lot of family ties in this denomination. A lot. So, for example, one of the things you can do is go back over the Heckman Library list of, they've PDF'd all of the years of Acts of Synod and agendas for Synod going all the way back to the beginning. So I've actually been reading some of them. And for example, Scott Greenway, who was a classmate of mine, who may likely be the president or the chair of this Synod, his grandfather was a chair of a number of synods. His father taught at Calvin Seminary and Westminster Seminary. So there's a lot of family ties in this church. Anyway, Kent has been doing a lot of really good numerical work on his Substack and a lot of analysis. One of the things in a recent article he posted, synodical decisions about women in office, henceforth previous thing, in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s passed by razor-thin margins. For example, Synod 1994's vote to undo Synod 1993's decision over women in office was 52% to 48%, as I recall. I can't find the source. I think it was noted somewhere in the overture in Synod 1995. Getting at these numbers on votes is a tricky thing because they're not recorded in the Acts of Synod generally. Often Synod chairs like to work with voice votes, so in many cases there are not numbers to record. Over the last couple of decades, there's been electronic voting, which has afforded faster voting rather than slips of paper, obviously, with more accurate numbers, and then often people will ask for the numbers. Noteworthy, at last year's Synod, the chair told Synod he wasn't going to give numbers, and that became a whole... Almost anything you do will become, especially in a time of conflict, a point of suspicion. And so, because Paul de Vries was sort of a moderate, nobody was quite sure what the political angle on not reporting numbers would be. Would it be to discourage the losing side? Would it be to encourage? What would be the point of not reporting numbers? And so that flipped back and forth a few times at that Synod. But for the votes around the human sexuality report in 2022 and 2023, the margins have not been thin. The margins have been fat, and fat indeed. Synod 2022 recommends the human sexuality report to churches by 131 to 45. Synod 2022 declared confessional status for denying same-sex marriage, the validity of it, 123 to 53. That is an enormous margin for synodical votes. And then a lot of people imagine, just as with women in office, when you had synods overturning previous year's decisions by razor-thin margins, Synod 2023 comes in, and Kneeland Avenue appealed the decision by Synod, mandating that Kneeland rescind her decision. She appealed it, and the appeal was rejected 124 to 47. Now, this was one of the sort of breathtaking moments of Synod 2023. Paul de Vries, who had been chairing the meeting up until then, also was a member of the in loco committee. What Synod 2022 did was name a committee to go to Classis Grand Rapids East and Kneeland Avenue, basically tell both of them, well, Kneeland Avenue, you need to rescind your decision. Classis Grand Rapids East, you need to have encourage Kneeland to rescind their decision. For the most part, the in loco committee was told there's a lot of debate about this, but a fairly polite no. We are not going to rescind our decision. This is a matter of conviction. We're not going back. And since 2022, more churches in Grand Rapids East and other churches have then sort of joined either the protest or they have released statements, often on their websites, affirming. Now, some people, of course, have been keeping tabs on these kinds of things. Unless you think it's some kind of conservative conspiracy, actually the All One Body and the Hesed Project, who are both sort of activist groups on the affirming side of these things, have been posting links to individual church websites. And so by this count, there were 17. I've seen numbers of like 20 in 8 different classes, but you can see most of those churches are from Grand Rapids East. And some things are on the website, other things are not. So here's the thing. There's roughly 1,000 churches in the Christian Reformed Church. In those numbers, there are some very small churches, but I would say there have to be at least 800 to 850 churches of 50 or 75 or 100 or more. And we have 20-ish churches that are affirming. And that doesn't necessarily reflect, let's say, the number of people in the church that feel passionately one way or another. Now, the kinds of people who get delegated to synod generally are the most passionate people. I did a video before showing basically ownership, that if you go back and look at acts of synod year after year, most acts of synod most years have full slates of delegates and alternates. What we've been seeing over the last 20 years are more and more empty spaces, and even in a synod as consequential as this one, there are many, many empty slots in the alternate delegate category. As I noted here, look at all these lines where there are no alternates, and the item that surprised me the most was Classis Hudson. Now, when I was growing up in New Jersey, there were basically two different classes. One tended to be a little bit more progressive and the other a little bit more conservative. This was back in the 70s and 80s with the kinds of issues that were going on then. But Classis Hudson was a very viable, strong classis, and only 2 minister delegates and no delegates of anything else and no alternate delegates in a synod as consequential as this. Yeah, it sort of speaks to the crisis that the denomination is in. So these are notes from the Acts of Synod 2023. The advisory committee recommended that Synod instruct Neeland Avenue to immediately rescind any and all decisions to ordain office bearers who are in same-sex marriage relationships, thus nullifying any current or former terms of such office bearer. Now, the office bearer around which all of the attention has focused has since termed out, so she is no longer in office. But that doesn't mean that sort of this is done, because Neeland Ave and a whole bunch of other churches, by virtue of the statements they are putting on their website, are signaling that they, in fact, have no intention of changing their minds. That Synod instruct Neeland Avenue to uphold our shared denominational covenants and procedures as laid out in the Church Order of the Covenant for Office Bearers. That Synod instruct Classis Grand Rapids East to guide the Neeland Avenue CRC congregation and leadership into alignment with the biblical guidelines affirmed in Synod 2022 regarding same-sex sexual relationships. That Synod instruct the members of the denomination to recommit themselves to the methods and processes that they have adopted in the Covenant for Office Bearers. That Synod declare the work of the Neeland Avenue in loco committee completed. So that was a committee of which Paul DeVries was a part, who went to Neeland Avenue and went to Classis Grand Rapids East. They filed reports. You can find those reports in the agenda for Synod. And that passed. So Synod told Neeland Avenue and Classis Grand Rapids East, reaffirm. Now, the second thing that the advisory committee said was that Synod create a new in loco committee to continue the oversight of Classis Grand Rapids East and Neeland Avenue in complying with synodical decisions. We recommend that at least 2 members of the 2022 in loco committee be included and that the remaining members be appointed by Synod. Evidence of this compliance will consist of the following: a letter of repentance by Neeland Avenue CRC to the churches of the Christian Reformed Church acknowledging their breaking of covenant and seeking reconciliation. A public written statement from Neeland Avenue through the Office of the General Secretary acknowledging their commitment to these two recommendations that pertain to this. A public written statement from Classis Grand Rapids East through the Office of General Secretary acknowledging their commitment to Recommendation 1, adopted above. In other words, they were going to send a new in loco committee back to Neeland and Grand Rapids asking that they, in fact, repent and turn around and probably, there's absolutely no indication that Neeland Avenue, Grand Rapids East, or given the number of churches from Grand Rapids East that have made some such statements either in their council, there's absolutely no indication that they are going to turn around. Now, that then provided a major point of discussion on the floor because Paul DeVries, who had been chairing the meeting, was also on the in loco committee. He, as a delegate, not as the chair, he released the chair, went so that he could operate as someone from the in loco committee. After chairing synod the whole time, then basically turned around and spoke forcefully against the proposal that a second in loco committee be established. And then he was about at the end of discussion. And then that second recommendation was defeated. And what that left was, well, Neyland and Grand Rapids East are in violation of what the denomination is of what Synod is asking them to do, but there was no action that was taken. And the appeal that Paul made was Neyland filed an appeal. They've just not just a few minutes or an hour or so ago, heard that their appeal was denied. Now you're sending a new in loco committee. This is punitive. This is harsh. And the vote was not verbalized what it was, so we don't know how close or how far apart that vote was. And we don't know what was on the minds of the delegates. So this moment is actually quite pertinent. Because as you know, it's one thing to tell someone to stop. It's another thing to threaten the relationship to try to tell them to stop. Now you might say, well, that's perfectly natural, and it may very well be that enough people listened to Paul DeVries, clearly enough people listened to Paul DeVries and said, yep, let's be patient with this. And so they decided to be patient with us, and they gave Grand Rapids East and Neyland another year. According to the person that put together this spreadsheet and sent it to me, many of the churches on this list decided after Synod then to have their council basically post a resolution either in protest of Synod or to put something up on their website or to pass something in their minutes, basically continuing to protest the decision of Synod 2022. In other words, what Synod 2023 didn't really slow churches moving in that direction. It fortified churches that already believed and were in disagreement and sort of steeled their mettle, or at least brought them to the place where they would publicly acknowledge their disagreement with this. And of course, this has not gone unnoticed. Now, this might set up another video that I might make, because there are ways to change in the Christian Reformed Church, and in many churches, there are ways to change the beliefs of the church, and there are proper procedures. It's been known for quite a while that any attempt, because of what happened in Synod 2016, any attempts to sort of have Synod go affirming or have a local option, clearly the votes aren't there, and in fact it seems that votes are probably in decline for that to happen. But there was a meeting of All One Body in 2018, and there is a report of that meeting that was written up on the CRC network. And basically, it was acknowledged that this is not going to change. I'll put the link to this below. It was not going to change. And so then, well, what should the approach be of churches that wanted to change the Christian Reformed Church with respect to this? The panel members, the judicial strategy, the panel members recognized that the legislative approach of getting Synod to actually pass something that would affirm it, of sending an overture to Synod, was not likely to turn the CRC into an all-inclusive ally of the LGBTQ plus promoters. Now, this was written by someone who is a known person in the denomination who is a conservative. So understand that his language has that slant. The network is pretty much open to almost anybody to post an article on. He's not an employee of the Christian Reformed Church or anything like that. They also exhibited pessimism that the 2021 synodical report on human sexuality removed the CRC closer to their desired outcome. Now, of course, this was 2018 that this was written. Nobody knew that a pandemic would happen. And the real turning point happened in 2016 when Synod 2016 decided, this was a big moment and it was a big surprise, decided that in the putting together of the members of the Human Sexuality Report, they would only include members on that study committee who at the outset affirmed the position of the Christian Reformed Church. Part of what the reason for that was that a committee had come back to Synod 2026 with a majority and a minority report, and the majority and the minority report was seen as being more in favor of openness to this, of change in the Christian Reformed Church. And so the sense was that, well, it's time to address this. And so Synod 2016 made that decision. And so All One Body in 2018 looked at that and said, no, we're not going to get the kind of report we want for Synod 2021, which didn't happen. Got postponed to Synod 2022. Because of this, the panel revealed their preference for a strategy using judicial rulings similar to the way secular activists won their case at the United States Supreme Court in Obergefell. All One Body's plan to transform the CRC will proceed as follows. They will identify a current CRC pastor who is sympathetic to their cause, who is willing to perform a homosexual wedding ceremony, or taking another route, they will find CRC congregation that is willing to elect an elder or deacon who is openly and proudly living in a homosexual partnership. Inevitably, this will cause a firestorm of protest in the CRC. Complaints will be filed, debate will ensue, the banner will publish articles for and against. The great brouhaha will eventually make its way to Synod. And in the hope of the part of All One Body that synodical delegates will embrace the path of least resistance and rule in favor of the pastor or the church or the office bearer. Synod might decide, as it has done with other controversial issues, that the LGBTQ plus Synod is a matter for each local church to decide, or if the personal story of the individual involved is especially powerful, Synod might embrace the empathy as a path towards inclusion. Perhaps a desire to prove the CRC's relevancy credentials will convince Synod to get with the times. Now, this, of course, was in some ways what happened with Women in Church Office, except, as we saw earlier, those vote margins were razor thin. This proved to be nothing like that. And even though I'm not going to say that Neeland Avenue sort of complied with this strategy, this is in fact how it rolled out. And again, what happened was the report that came to Synod 2022, the Human Sexuality Report, was a conservative report. And as noted by the numbers, it was quite decisively put into effect. And then Synod 2023 did the same thing. And by virtue of the fact that you're not probably going to see, this is back to my thesis about the circulatory system and all the kinds of reasons that I've outlined in videos for the last few years, there's not going to be a change in this. Synod 2024 is going to be a conservative synod. You will probably not have in the future a liberal synod in the Christian Reformed Church. I don't think that's going to happen. What will likely happen will be some sort of split. The only way that would happen is if what we've seen happen in places like the United Methodist or the PCUSA, if conservatives decide they're going to leave, then suddenly moderates, then the balance tips again. But there's nothing in these numbers to suggest that that will happen. You cannot account for these numbers based on, well, just a few conservative people from a few classes went to Synod. No, there's general conservatism. And while the numbers of churches that are putting forth affirming numbers, these numbers, probably 70-30, probably is better representative of the membership of the Christian Reformed Church on this subject. But the reason that those numbers don't translate into, let's say, 70-30 in website numbers is because if these numbers, generally speaking, are where things are at, it's probably true that in the vast majority of churches, those are the numbers representative within the churches that are electing elders and deacons and calling pastors. In other words, the up to 30% of the denomination that might be leaning in a certain way or affirming in a certain way, they're probably either have made their peace that they live in a conservative congregation and that's the way it is, and these are their friends and this is their church, and even though they feel differently, they're going to stay there, or they're going to leave. Again, this is why churches tend to break right and leak left. So again, it's highly unlikely we're going to see a change of direction in this. The only questions will be, how exactly will discipline be done? And will it be sufficient discipline to satisfy conservatives and encourage them that they in fact are in control and will remain in control, and not be too harsh to alienate moderates, when that's likely precisely what happened when Paul de Vries, a moderate, said, this is too harsh, this is unwise. You can go back, he starts at 322, and I'll put the link and I'll put the timestamp in the link below. So that's probably really what we're looking at. Those will be the exciting things. Now, there'll be lots of other things that happen, and some of the things people who know the system better will look at and say, that's significant. And then there'll be things that all of us miss, and 5, 10, 15 years later, someone will go back and look at it and say, that speech given right there, or that piece of data right there, that wound up being important. And that's sort of the way these things go. So let me know what you think. Leave a comment.